Greetings and blessings on this sixth Sunday of Easter. I'm Sarah Fischer. I'm the rector of Saints Peter and Paul, San Pedro y San Pablo, and it is a great pleasure to be coming to you in this virtual, pre-recorded world in which we live. In addition to being the rector of Saints Peter and Paul, I am currently moonlighting as the interim executive director of Rahab's Sisters. Some of you may be familiar with Rahab's Sisters because we used to go around and speak to parishes around the diocese. And back when we used to have diocesan convention, remember diocesan convention? We would occasionally have a table or sometimes a presentation. Rahab Sisters was founded in 2003 at Saints Peter and Paul as a collaborative ministry of that parish and the Metro East Convocation and the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon. And our mission was to provide hospitality to women who were marginalized by the sex industry, houselessness, drug addiction, and poverty, and even simply by loneliness. Over the years, Rahab Sisters has grown exponentially, but our core has always been serving women. And I say us and we, although I've been in and out of that ministry for a long time and was away for quite a few years when I was living in Seattle. Some years ago, Rahab Sisters had a trans woman who became part of their Friday night community, and she did a lot of teaching to the guests and volunteers and staff about inclusion and about hospitality and about the incredible vulnerability inherent in being gender nonconforming. And so Rahab Sisters expanded their services to include anyone whose gender identity made them vulnerable. And now we just say women and gender nonconforming guests. 2020 was a year of tremendous growth for Rahab Sisters. The board and staff had great plans for additional staff and for a deepening and broadening of current programs. And then the pandemic hit. This has happened to all of us, of course. For Rahab Sisters, the growth happened, but not in the ways that we had planned. In the first weeks of the pandemic, we realized, well, first of all, that we weren't going to close. And we realized that many of the people who were coming to us for help and hanging out in our parking lot on Friday nights, which is where we were serving people, were men. And Rahab Sisters began to serve men for the very first time. People worried, what will this do to our core mission? What does it mean about who we are? But the staff and the volunteers on the ground simply said, people are hungry. These are extraordinary times. And then the guests who came and gathered in the parking lot started telling us about their friends who couldn't get there on a Friday night, who were living in tents in encampments of homeless people in other parts of our neighborhood. So one of our volunteers had a dream and thought, what if I just make a bunch of meals and drive out to where these camps are and bring them food? And then we started having organized camp outreach, which still happens on Sunday afternoons, caravans, 3 or 4 different caravans of 3 or 4 cars take supplies and food to multiple encampments throughout the Montevilla area, and we probably serve about 200 meals. And people said, I don't know if this is part of our core mission. I don't know if this is part of who we are. And the board of directors worried. This makes us so vulnerable to be going out to visit camps. And the volunteers on the ground said, yep, but we're all about vulnerability. So even though Rahab Sisters has morphed over the years into a secular nonprofit and would probably not themselves use language of ministry and good news, I believe that Rahab Sisters throughout its history has continued to respond to the nudging of the Spirit, to expand their ministry and spread the good news of radical hospitality far beyond the doors of the church building where they operate. I tell this story because of the many similarities, which you may have already seen, with the story of Peter and Cornelius's household, the tail end of which we get in today's first reading. The whole story, as you may remember, is this. Peter and Cornelius each have a dream or a vision about the other. Peter's dream of a great picnic on the roof of the place where he is staying is a message from God. Take and eat, even foods which you've been taught are unclean. Put aside the dietary customs of Judaism in order to bring the gospel to this Gentile household. Some members of this household are on their way at this very moment to invite you to come and eat with them. Cornelius's vision is the instruction to send those people to invite Peter to his house. Peter goes and he begins to tell the story of Jesus that we have heard him tell several times in the book of Acts. But the Holy Spirit interrupts. While Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. The Holy Spirit is essentially saying, enough of this. Let's get these people baptized. Because this is what God, the Holy Spirit, does. God, the Holy Spirit, disrupts our plans and our ideas of how things ought to go, and usually does that for the purpose of ever expanding conversion, for the purposes of giving more and more people the good news of beloved community. Because God's kingdom is bigger than we can possibly imagine. It is not just Cornelius and his household, which would have been a fairly large group, who are converted in this moment. Peter and his companions have a new understanding of God's love and God's mission. Just when we think we know what we're about and what our mission is, the Holy Spirit comes along and says, actually, do this instead. Do more. So Peter does. He knows the power of the Spirit when he sees it, and so he seals the crowd's conversion experience with baptism. Can you imagine this happening today? It would be a glorious occasion for all involved. But check out what happens next in the book of Acts. Peter goes up to Jerusalem, and the more established Christians there call him out. They don't say, why did you baptize all those people? They don't say, can Gentiles really be Christian without becoming Jewish first? Even though that's kind of what the book of Acts is all about. They say, Why did you enter the house of a Gentile and eat with him? Why didn't you follow the rubrics? What were you thinking? These words are coming from faithful believers, longtime followers of Jesus. And yet, this is what they focus on. How quickly the church has become the church. How many times have you been in a conversation that includes someone, maybe yourself, because I've been that person, who asks, but what about our building? What about people who don't like organ music? Or what about people who do like organ music? What about people who aren't comfortable around trans people? What about people who don't like noisy children in church? Human beings are funny creatures. It is our human nature to stick with what is familiar, to hold on to what we think is true, even when it keeps us back, even in the face of a call to stretch ourselves to a greater truth. It seems that it really does go against human nature to take what the Holy Spirit offers. Years ago, there was a speaker at Diocesan Convention, I think it was 2008 or 2009, who told a very detailed parable that I don't have time to tell about the church on the beach. The high bluff on which this church had been built was slowly, very slowly sliding into the ocean. And the church's whole identity was changing. The piece of that story, which I have never forgotten, is the question that came at the very end of the story. What do you need to keep in order to be faithful? And what do you need to let go of in order to be faithful? What do you need to keep in order to be faithful? And what do you need to let go of in order to be faithful? This was the question for the earliest Christians that we've been reading about throughout the book of Acts this Easter season. And it is the question for us. As long as the Spirit continues to interrupt us and call us to deepen and widen our reach, that will always be the question. As we prepare for the great feast of Pentecost, what will God the Spirit come along and disrupt? How is God at this very moment preparing us to be converted again and again to a bigger dream of God's kingdom than we can possibly imagine?